Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you this week, COVID is causing precocious puberty. A ridiculous health idea that involves taping your mouth shut for a good night's sleep. FDA to ban the use of certain ingredients in decongestives. Millions have been infected by a disease and then suddenly it disappeared. Salmonella outbreaks occurring across Europe, and we're all excited to see how that goes. The Sperm defy some of the rules of physics, which isn't all that surprising. Studies into lead poisoning in a part of India shows that it might be related to spice. There is a push for the High Court to overturn a decision banning golden rice. Alcohol consumption is far more common in animals than first thought. The origins of kissing and just how gross it is. The stupidity in academia, and particularly around peer-reviewed desire for self-referencing by reviewers. AlphaFold is finally released to the public, and an impossible proof demonstrated by a high school student. The timestamp for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with precocious puberty, or as it's called, idiopathic precocious puberty. And in this case, no, it is not that we don't know why children go through puberty and become a pain. It is actually a particular medical condition in which puberty becomes a problem much earlier on in life for children, and we don't know why. Hence the three words, idiopathic, as in idiots, and we don't know why, precocious as in it's a pain, and puberty, well, suffering. The weird thing here is that it's not just randomly happening. It appears to be tied closely, but in an unknown way, to COVID-19. Yeah, well, one of the newer weird consequences of COVID-19 is a surge in the number of instances of idiopathic precocious puberty, and not just in local instances, but across the world. Understand, we are slightly exaggerating to say across the world. The studies are primarily located in Turkey, but they do appear to be able to be extrapolated out to other parts of the world, so it's not entirely hyperbolic, but somewhat. The reason the researchers give is that scrolling through your various devices and spending forever staring at a screen during lockdowns is what caused this, which does seem a bit, let's say, optimistic. The claims are not necessarily unreasonable, just that it does seem a touch, no, it's a lot, a massive leap in logic. The rationale they give is that children, when they're exposed to extreme amounts of LED light, and particularly the blue light from your phone screen or similar, do tend to contribute to early or premature puberty in an animal model. Now, whether or not the exposure for humans is enough to alter melatonin levels and therefore have an effect on reproductive hormone levels in humans is a different question, mostly because they both can't really experiment on children, that damn ethics issue, but also we don't know if that's the only factor. So there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, and to be honest, the research here doesn't really do so. In rather more useful news, we have the use of stem cells to restore vision in a number of people. Although this is a clinical trial, it's a fairly large clinical trial considering what it is. It is, however, also done in Japan, and given the Japanese penchant for all kinds of exotic and exciting research, and anime for that matter, this may or may not hold true. But we are fairly well into the study or clinical trial at this stage, and there haven't been any major concerns that are developed, so it does look like it should be positive, and should last. Then again, it's only 4 people, so it's a really small study. The entire idea is to treat a condition that's called limbal stem cell deficiency, and it's a condition which affects the cornea, causing it to become similar in a way to, let's say, cataracts in a manner of speaking. It makes it very hard to see. The key thing with this research is that, much like other more recent stem cell research, this doesn't rely on sourcing particular kinds of stem cells. Rather, what the researchers are able to do is essentially take a blood sample, process it in such a way that they wind up with only stem cells from the blood, and then coax those stem cells into differentiating into exactly what they need for the individual's eyes to be treated. And in doing so, they have returned eyesight to 4 patients, and there appear to be no issues about a year later. We say no issues. There is one caveat to that, and that is one of the patients, although appearing to improve for a time, did regress afterwards, and therefore the treatment hasn't made them better, but they aren't any worse off either. We can't say the same thing for the next news item, wherein individuals are, for all intents and purposes, gagging themselves with tape in an effort to deal with their sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is, to be blunt, a fairly significant concern, as it can cause pretty big problems. It's also closely associated with some other major cardiovascular diseases like heart disease and stroke. Because during sleep apnea you stop breathing, mostly due to airway collapse, there's a pretty big problem where you may not wake up during your sleep. Because of this, things like CPAP machines or continuous positive airway pressure machines help to keep you alive and breathing. Other devices that are rather less invasive are mandibular advancement devices, which are similar to a mouthguard in a way, and they're intended to do something similar by forcing the airway open. There are, of course, problems with this, not least of which is that it is rather uncomfortable, but it is far better than death in most instances. This has led people to search for a less uncomfortable, less invasive, and certainly much cheaper option than either of the two mentioned interventions. This leads us to the ridiculous idea of what if you just tape your mouth shut? This is one thing that people should consider when they're typing out these dumb ideas online, rather than actually trying to do it themselves. If you tape your hands shut, you can't spread nonsense like this. And the reason it's nonsense is kinda simple. First of all, no study that's tried it has found that it can really offer the same kind of benefits. Second, even if you were to find some kind of benefit, the downsides are much worse. This includes breathing issues when you are sleeping. And when you have breathing issues during sleep, you wind up with a situation in which you have too much carbon dioxide in your body and not enough oxygen, causing stress. That stress can then lead to more issues. And then, of course, you have exacerbation of symptoms that are associated with sleep apnea. So, no, this does not work at all. And in fact, can make things much, much worse for yourself, even if it is cheaper, marginally more comfortable, and arguably less invasive. In similar dumb ideas, we have the vitamin C myth. That is, vitamin C, if you take it, will make you better once you're sick with something like, say, the common cold or influenza. The answer to this is no. Arguably, if you were to start taking vitamin C 6 months before you got sick, you might see some benefit as we've described previously. But that's not really going to hold if you're starting to take it after you get sick. You're not going to see any benefit. The guy who gave rise to all this, Linus Pauling, was a scientist in the 70s, and basically he's to blame for this shit show. Now, there is some limited evidence, to be clear about this, that vitamin C intake in some individuals can be beneficial. However, that benefit generally arises from the fact that they have a diet otherwise insufficient in vitamin C, and therefore you're not actually adding vitamin C to the diet in terms of recommended dietary intake. Rather, you're just bringing them up to what they should already be at. And this is one of the problems underlying a lot of the research that tries to prove vitamin C is good. You just can't reproduce the results because of this sort of dietary variance in people. Of course, we're not the only ones to ever say this, and in fact, the article we refer you to in the description box below basically refers to another person who has a TikTok video explaining just why it is vitamin C won't do anything for you. Sure, you may feel better, it may be a placebo effect, and there's no harm in taking it for that reason, but it's never in its own right going to lead to you actually getting better. In similar news related to things like a cold, influenza, and so on, certain medications are about to be banned from using oral phenylephrine, which is one of the more common medications included in these. You find it in all kinds of things, whether it's Sudafed, Mucinex, Benadryl, Advil, Tylenol, Vicks, Dimetapp, and so on. All of these have the same ingredient, but the problem is That ingredient, that being phenylephrine, doesn't have the necessary substance to support its presence and use. Essentially, it's a thing that's there because it has always been there, rather than being there because it actually has a substantive body of evidence that it works, and that's a bit of a problem. Now, this is unlike, say, a pseudoephedrine, which was at one point present and taken out because it was far too useful in producing meth.
There ain't that many Smurfs in the world.
Instead of being a similar product, this is just there now because it always has been. And so the FDA is being surprisingly proactive in deciding that, no, actually, we are going to prevent you from selling that, because we no longer see benefit to the public. You might think, okay, but is this going to have any negative effects? And honestly, not really. Without having this particular drug present, the medication you take won't make your stuffy nose any better or any other effects really. You might as well be taking a placebo at that point, and it would be curious to know if these companies will actually replace it with some sort of random placebo. The other option is that we might well see the drug manufacturers going back to including pseudoephedrine inside of their decongestants, and even more issues around control of the supply of this particular kind of cold and flu medication. In terms of flu or influenza, we have happy news for all the epidemiologists and virologists out there. More infections of humans by H5N1 avian influenza. This is fun. Our next exciting and exotic disease has definitely cemented its place, because in 2024 there has been a relative surge in cases. Understand, in 2021 there weren't that many, we were picking up one or two. 2022 it jumped up to a handful maybe. 2023 it was the mid to high teens. 2024 and we've already got 60 cases and the year's not even over. Yeah, it looks like that's definitely going to be the next disease we have to worry about, and make sure you stock up your masks and similar now. The problem is that we're not just seeing one particular variant spreading. There are several different clades that have emerged, and that's one of the causes for worry. At the moment, the clade version 2.3.4.4b and 2.3.2.1c appear to be spreading most significantly. So yeah, this is not fun. There is a small amount of good news at least. Well, calling it good news might perhaps be a rather optimistic take. It's an incredibly deadly disease, which means if you get infected, you won't suffer for too long, hopefully, because you're either going to get better or be dead. So you don't need to worry about getting yourself a bottle of decongestants. It's a very thin silver lining. Of course, it's not just that avian influenza is spreading and getting at a faster rate, it's where it's spreading. In this case, we have a teenager in Canada who's been infected, which should be considered unusual. Understand, very young children and the very elderly are relatively vulnerable to being infected by most diseases, but particularly viruses like the common cold and influenza. But once you get towards the latter end of puberty and become an adult, and then through to about 40 or 50 years old, you tend to be fairly resilient. You'll get infected, yes, but you shouldn't suffer much in the way of effects. In Canada, this may not be true, at least for this particular teenager who appears to have been infected. The only thing to look out for now is whether or not we go from having the occasional flare-up and the seemingly consistent animal-to-human transmission to getting a human-to-human transmission. Once that happens, we're in for a really shit time. Think COVID lockdown kind of shit time. In other news related to exciting diseases, we have a disease that spread and infected millions, and then seemed to just disappear like a flash in the pan. This disease is called encephalitis lethargica, or sleepy sickness. The problem we have is that it basically began seemingly in 1917, lasted for a couple of years, and then it was gone. And we don't really know what caused it. The problem is that about half the people who were infected at the time died, which does mean there's a bit of an issue. Mostly because, well, any disease that spreads to that many individuals and that kills most, well, in this case half of them, is a worry. for good reason. This is where the article in question is rather, interesting but not necessarily useful, as it's entirely a theory. The theory is that rather than being an infectious disease, this was instead a form of autoimmune disease. That is, encephalitis lethargica was a case of the human body's immune system turning around and attacking itself, and particularly the brain, which would explain what happens. The thought is that due to the nature of what was happening at that time, and for example you have things like the Spanish flu, it could have theoretically been an instance of the human body reacting to infection by some other pathogen or something similar, that then caused a significant overreaction, leading to the immune system eventually inadvertently and then deliberately attacking the human body. Essentially an overactive response followed by a unfortunate but very much consistent reliable autoimmune response. In other disease-related news, we have the idea of private cruise ships and the idea that private hot tubs on these could be a significant risk for disease. This does come out of the CDC, so they're not exactly the biggest fan of things like hot tubs, but the reason they're raising the concern here is simple. There have been 2 outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease, both tied to the use or at least presence of these sorts of hot tubs on private cruise ships, and that's a concern because they're not exactly an unusual phenomenon and feature of these. More than that, between 2022 and 2024, at least 10 cases tied to 12 cases, so essentially 10 out of every 12 individuals, had to be hospitalized because they were so seriously infected by Legionnaire's disease. What makes the essentially private cruise ship and hot tub so dangerous is twofold. First of all, the environment, and particularly the temperature in the hot tub, is just perfect for Legionnaire's disease to grow. This means you get a nice little colony and you have a nice moist environment, which allows you to inhale the water full of Legionnaire's disease, and that puts it straight into the bottom of your lungs, where it can set up home and make you very ill. The second reason is, simply put, people aren't necessarily great on keeping up with their maintenance, and that means that if you don't regularly not only drain the hot tub, but replace the water and ensure that the water meets all the necessary requirements to be safe, it's going to make a nice home for them. A nice home that leads to you getting hospitalized. So yeah. This is why going outside is a bad idea, and why leaving the house at all is a bad idea. The hikikomori lifestyle is the best lifestyle. In other news that will keep you inside, we have Salmonella spreading across parts of Europe. Europe is well known for its outbreak of various bacterial diseases, mostly related to the organic food industry. In this case, however, it doesn't necessarily appear to be related, particularly to the organic industry. Rather, it's related to eggs, meat from pigs, turkeys, and chickens. So, this is going to be fun. The cases are most pronounced towards the far side of Europe, so places like Ukraine, Poland, and that sort of side of Europe. However, they are by no means the only places. Other significant outbreaks have been in places like France, Spain, and even Poland. Weirdly enough, Germany and Italy seem to be less affected, which you would think they would be more affected. But making salami and whatever Germans put into their sausage, it seems to be working to protect them and keep them out of trouble. It could also be the fact that the European Food Safety Agency believes that particular tomatoes coming out of Sicily could be the cause. Specifically, they're talking about small tomatoes that were shipped throughout most of Europe may be the cause of the outbreak, going all the way back to 2011, let alone the same, particular clade of Salmonella in 2023 and 2024. In other news related to pathogens, but this time pathogens that are working to make you better in a somewhat twisted way. It's a article from Nature that has proven to be rather contentious because it talks about a scientist that not only treated their own cancer with a virus they grew in their own laboratory, but that they're not only reporting on it. Now, the issue here is several-fold. The first you have is, quite simply, Is it ethical to do so? And the answer is yes. There is a long-standing understanding that a scientist can experiment on themselves. It's led to a surprising number of Nobel Prizes. The problem now is whether or not it's ethical to report on this self-trial or self-experimentation in such a way that others might be able to copy you. And that's arguably where the second issue is. Now, to be clear about it, the idea is not without merit. It's incredibly preliminary, but there is at least some modicum of evidence to support it. And not a lot, mind you, but there is certainly some. This is why the question is whether or not, based on a very preliminary study, a study for a condition which you are already going to have the abscess, or in this case tumor, removed, and that it doesn't alter anything for you individually, is reporting on it that wrong. And we'll certainly leave it up to you to decide. It's simply worth pointing out that there's a fairly big ethical controversy over just what has happened. In other news that's less related to pathogens in the conventional sense, and more depending on how you view children. It's scientists defying at least one of the laws of physics, although arguably probably more than one given the simple reality that humanity continues to survive no matter what we do. The problem here is regarding Newton's third law of motion. The gist of it is that these small cells, whether they are algae or sperm, move through a substance that should in theory be resisting their motion. That is, a physical object should not only exert force but have force exerted back on it in turn. More typically summarized as, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. The explanation the researchers have concluded is that although you are adding energy to the environment and therefore allowing the sperm or algae to move, the flagella in both instances have a degree of elasticity, and it's described as an odd elasticity, that allows them to move about, but in doing so they don't lose energy to the environment in as significant an amount as you might expect. Therefore, although you are putting out a small amount of energy, the small amount of energy coming back, that opposite reaction, isn't enough to stop them from moving around. Going now to food-related news, but it's also health-related news. It's looking at the relationship between aluminium cookpots and essentially lead poisoning in Afghanistan, or at least Afghan refugee children. Importantly, there is a lot of, confounding evidence in this, mostly in that, first of all, they're looking at Afghan children, which raises ethics issues. All the children have been resettled in the United States of America, and the exposure is not necessarily consistent. But if we take the basic premise as granted, the gist of it is that because the individuals, I understand that we're talking about just 40 individuals, were using a cookpot that is made with aluminium but seemed to have an extraordinarily high amount of lead in it, when you ate food prepared in said cookpot, you would end up consuming a very high amount of lead. In fact, a ridiculous amount of lead. Understand, there are fairly low levels that are allowed, and we mean really low levels. However, the children here were exceeding the amounts that are allowed by hundreds of times, if not verging on thousands. Yeah, the problem is very simply that the pressure cooker that the, traditional cook is using in Afghanistan is very simple. It's a large aluminium pot. It doesn't seem like anything particularly exciting from the outside, but however they're manufacturing it is leading to a huge amount of lead winding up inside that pot, and that lead is released not only when it's heated, but heated under pressure. This lead, because it ends up leaching into the food, is then consumed, and it bypasses some of the most significant barriers that should prevent lead poisoning. This being things like your skin, for instance. Because of that, it goes straight to the GI tract to bloodstream to your body. And because children are consuming the food, children are ending up in a situation where they're getting effectively lead poisoning. To be clear about it, Flint, Michigan was considered an absolute disaster, a shit show of monumental proportions, a clusterfuck that led to the entire state of Michigan being internationally embarrassed, and the amount of lead that these children are exposed to from these cooking devices is well and truly leagues above that level of exposure. Of course, Afghan lead cookpots aren't the only source of lead poisoning. Another fairly common source, which is unfortunate for parts of Bangladesh, is turmeric. Turmeric appears to be contaminated, whether deliberately or not, through the use of lead. The reason it's been identified is that although Bangladesh has stopped using lead in just about all of its commonly available things, like for example petroleum, it still remains at surprisingly high levels in blood, which raises a question: where, what, why, and how? The what appears to be turmeric. The why and how is a much more difficult question to answer. The what, at least, is very simply that turmeric has been adulterated with lead. The reason it's being adulterated is that, well, it makes up the bulk of it adds colour, and you don't really know it's there until you lose a large amount of brain function due to its neurotoxic effects. And you may not even notice it if you start consuming it as a child, in which case your brain development is so badly retarded that, well, you don't have the brain capacity to be able to figure out that you've been poisoned with lead. This is where non-government organizations and international research has helped considerably. They identified, at least as early as 2019, that this was a big problem. It's not a small isolated event. In fact, they found nationally that this was pretty much common. So yeah, it needed to be dealt with at a national level. And Bangladesh's Food Safety Authority became involved. They've tried to fix this, and understand we say try for a good reason, with a two-part approach. First, education campaigns to warn people about lead, which, depending on how badly they've been poisoned already, may or may not help. The other is that they've been analysing turmeric and they've been finding sellers who appear to be adulterating it with lead, which we would argue is only half an answer, as they should also be punishing them for trying to poison people. The reason they can do the simple approach of being able to analyse samples and find sellers very quickly is that they've been using what are essentially small hand analyzers. They're X-ray fluorescent analyzers, which are portable, very effective, and very quick to work. And it means that they can very quickly, very easily identify if something is in this that shouldn't be, and then they can act on it. The very, very thin silver lining to this is not lead, fortunately, but what it is that by adding a penalty in the form of fines to the spice market sellers, they've no longer made it financially feasible or effective to sell contaminated lead, whether they know it or not, and as such, those who continue to do so will fairly quickly go out of business because they can't afford to pay the fines, and those who don't will, although not making as much money, at least not go out of business. In other dietary news, we have an article from the Genetic Literacy Project, which it argues that Western diets need to change to meet sustainability challenges, which we definitely disagree with that on several levels, but in part they are right. The biggest thing we agree on is that there is a lot of resistance from consumers on the consumption of things like insects or plant-based meats. Mostly because, well, plant-based meat is not meat, it's a plant, and vegans are assholes and nobody wants to be an asshole. Assuming though that people want to eat bugs or are willing to eat some sort of alternative, there are ways to go about it. The simplest and most reliable, if you are that concerned about sustainability, is things like lab-grown meat, or essentially cell culture. If not that, then other options would be things like dietary advice, which has people consuming a modest amount of meat. Most diets, at least in the West, are, well, to be blunt about it, excessive in the amount of meat they consume. And if you were to bring the amount of meat consumed in that diet down to a reasonable level commensurate with what is actually needed for a healthy diet, the amount of environmental impact from the meat element of that food significantly drops, arguably to levels on par with things like a vegan diet, while not being a vegan diet at all. And of course you have things like pescatarian diets, vegetarian diets, and similar, which are far better than vegan diets, mostly because nobody knows you are until you start looking at that part of the diet. You're not telling them. This is one of the major reasons why people are so resistant to the idea. And this is just based on the idea that we are working on a normal diet, let alone plant-based imitation meats or eating bugs, because bugs really aren't going to be very attractive to most people until we start getting the Soylent Green equivalent of a bug product. That is, you would have no idea it's made from bugs until you start asking questions, or doing some sort of investigative journalism. Going now from what is the Western diet to what would be the mostly Asia Pacific and Asian diets. It's the idea of golden rice, and particularly golden rice in the Philippines. It's a continued pursuit of approval from the High Court to allow for golden rice to be grown. Understand, the issue here is that there was an application by Greenpeace, who seem to hate children and people being healthy, to stop it being grown. The reason for this is that they don't like the idea it's a genetically modified form of rice. A genetically modified form of golden rice that was modified so that it had extra vitamin A. Well, it had vitamin A full stop. Vitamin A being rather important because it allows for things like eyesight, heart, and other health. This is more pronounced in children who, in at least the Philippines, tend to not get enough vitamin A. So yes, this is why Greenpeace hates children, and also why they didn't want it being grown. Greenpeace considered golden rice to be a threat to life, health, or property across 2 or more municipalities, and that is the basis on which they applied for this. Oh well, we can only hope. Admittedly, rice is not the only staple crop that is currently going through its own growing pains with regards to genetic engineering or genetic modification. Potatoes are in a similar boat, although in this case it's not so much the, let's say, addition of features, rather it's just making them more reliable. In this case, it's that a particular form of potato is able to essentially limit its nitrogen uptake, and by doing that, you can reduce the amount of fertilizer, in the form of nitrogen-based fertilizers, needed for the potato to grow. Potatoes being amongst the most grown crops in the world, essentially behind things like wheat and rice. By having the potato available that is effectively a low nitrogen requiring potato, you can avoid issues to do with, say, nitrogen runoff and other environmental concerns related to nitrate fertilizers. More than that, you reduce the cost of growing said potatoes. This means the potato plant spends more time growing its edible part and less time growing its above ground part, which is mostly to support the tuberous growth. In news related to animals now, and possibly potatoes if they're making schnapps, we have alcohol consumption and animals, and the fact that, well, being an alcoholic appears to be much more common than was previously thought. It's generally understood that most animals accessing alcohol tend to do so for one of 2 reasons. Either a very fortuitous accident for said animal, or alternatively a twitch thought and an idiotic idea that giving their cat vodka is a good idea. However, that may not be the case, at least in the former instance. It's definitely true in the latter. It appears that, at least in the natural world, there are a lot more animals that are eating not just sugary fruits and other foods, but are being exposed to ethanol produced when some of that doesn't go the way it's meant to go. This has other effects from an evolutionary perspective, mostly that we have several different evolutionary pathways. Part of this being the plants evolved sugar-rich fruits and similar content. Yeast developed the ability to make ethanol, and animals appear to have been able to jump on the bandwagon of nature's making alcohol, let's use it, by being able to consume and to a certain extent tolerate, and certainly use it at a metabolic level, ethanol-containing foods. Essentially, fruit juices that have been fermented, to an extent you could say cider, perry, mead, and similar, and then much later as humanity developed the ability to do things themselves, things like beer, wine, and so on. So yes, it would appear that animals as a whole, and particularly humans, developed a penchant for the good stuff and the social lubricant known as alcohol as an evolutionary advantage. In other news that's sort of evolution related, we have organoids, particularly brain organoids and the development of eyes. It's literally the organoids are staring at you while you're in the lab, and your research supervisor just has to gently nudge you and advise to ignore them, they'll go away soon enough. The article is useful mostly because it's talking about the reality that some of these things are not happening as planned. Mostly that for example, optical nerves and other structures related to being able to see in brain organoids wasn't intended. And because of this, we have some pretty big ethical questions about creating such organoids. The big question, and this is, to be clear about it, a really big question in terms of bioethics, is the closer we get to creating a real brain as an organoid, the closer we get to creating effectively sentient beings. And, well, once that thing in the petri dish starts thinking and be able to see, you have to worry. Not just for the fact that, well, you're doing something kind of monstrous to a thinking being, but you may not know it's a thinking being, and importantly, it may understand everything you're doing to it.
Sorry, kid.
That's alright.
A nice baby.
I'm not a baby, I'm a tumor.
On the other hand, the closer we are getting to an actual organoid and essentially realistic structure, the closer we are getting to be able to create something that accurately mimics what we need to explore to be able to develop real meaningful, let's say, developments. Things like treatments and cures for various conditions. Of course, again, this is based very much on the idea that things are moving far further than they already are. And things that are moved far further than you might think are the primal origins of kissing, and we're not talking about Kerrigan here. Rather, we're talking about the rather disgusting and squishy development of kissing amongst humans, similar to the idea of cooties and other childhood fantasies about how contact with the opposite sex is bad. It might be weird to say this, but for humans at least, kissing is a rather anomalous behavior. Some species do it, for example bonobos and chimpanzees, but not a lot, and in fact, there aren't as many as you might think. Other than apes, most species don't do so. They may lick each other, sure, but kissing, no. This brings us to where at least one, let's be blunt about it, questionable psychologist, given that they're an evolutionary psychologist, which sounds kind of contradictory, thinks they might have an answer, which, yeah. They think that it may be a byproduct of the relatively old ape process of essentially grooming each other, removing things like parasites, dead skin, and similar. One of the methods by which this could be done was with your mouth, and, well, it's essentially gone from the we used to clean each other this way to now we use it as a gesture of affection. Going to other weird news, we have America finally embracing the metric system in the weirdest way imaginable. It's an article talking about how police in Las Vegas seized thousands of grams of drugs, cannabis. Understand, the metric system's got a fairly simple system. You have 1 gram, then you have decigrams, which is 10 grams, then centigrams, which is 100 grams, and then kilograms. Kilo is thousands. Now, while deci and centi are not really common anymore, you basically go from being a measurement of grams and then a decimal point of kilograms, they still exist. Therefore, there is no need to say thousands of grams when you could just say so many kilograms. Unless the author is trying to do one of two things. Either A, they were very much trying to overstate how much was seized and hoping the American reader wouldn't know the difference. B, utterly ignorant of how the metric system actually measures things. Or C, managed to stuff up some sort of number. And possibly that the, name was meant to be thousands of kilograms and not thousands of grams, or thousandths of a gram, which, given the size we can see in the photo, is much less likely. Shifting from America's weird embrace of the metric system to instead weird peer review stuff. First of all, we have a bizarre tweet talking about how a peer reviewer, that is somebody who is reviewing a paper for publication in a scientific journal or similar, wanted other publications to be cited. Now, this is unusual and generally frowned upon as a faux pas, but it does happen if you are an expert in your field and you feel that you have certain publications that are significant and relevant. The issue here is that these citations are not relevant, and as such, insisting on them is a big issue. If this had been 1 or maybe 2 papers, it might have been able to slip by, mostly because 1 or 2 papers, although odd, it's a thing that can happen. You might mistakenly believe strongly that they are applicable. When you insist upon 13 to 14 papers, no. This is clearly a case of somebody trying to pad their resume, or an approximation thereof in academic terms. As such, it is a very big problem, and something that, ironically, of all journals recently, Elsevier really needs to look into, because that's a problem. In other technology news now, we shift to TSMC. TSMC is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturer Company or Corporation, and the fact that they are increasingly getting more business from companies like Intel. Understand that TSMC is essentially the world's one major chip manufacturer. It's not that they are a significant player, they are basically it. Once you get to the high end of any kind of semiconductor, you have no one else that can make them. A part of it is simply that there are no other facilities. The facilities that do exist aren't able to produce to the same high-end SKUs, and that if you want to try and make your own facility, you both need the technology and an absolute fortune to do so. This is one reason why Intel is, in part, one of the many companies that is increasingly placing orders with TSMC. Now, Intel's decision isn't necessarily based only on the fact that they need to increase their ordering. They are concerned that their foundry, that is their business responsible for making their in-house CPUs and therefore semiconductors, isn't going to be up to the task going forwards, so they're essentially getting in early and trying to increase their supply, as TSMC has an interesting approach to how it is that they manufacture and issue contracts to various corporations and companies. In less direct technology news, we have Google's DeepMind finally releasing the code behind the advanced protein prediction program that they had. The program is called AlphaFold 3, and it was, after a huge shit show, finally agreed that they would release it so that people could use this. The problem is very simple. They didn't do so for a very long time. In fact, there were certain concerns that they may not do so. What makes it necessary for Google to publish this particular code is that it came out in Nature back in May. One of the requirements for publishing in Nature is that any code, in this case computational code, must be made available alongside the study when it is published. But the paper only contained essentially a list of steps a program runs, and you weren't able to use it, or at least you weren't able to use it very reliably because you can only conduct a limited number of predictions each day. With the publication now, they should be able to do so, which is really important, not just because, you now have access to something you should have access to back in May, but what it does. The AlphaFold 3 is a system, let's say. It's a sort of AI, deep machine learning sort of thing that figures out how proteins not only are structured, but how they can interact with DNA, RNA, and proteins. That's really, really big, especially if we're looking at things like drug discovery, receptor, ligand interactions, and so on. If you want to be able to figure out how you can treat something if you know what the receptor is, and you know what the necessary ligand that matches to it is, you are much further along than you would otherwise be, and it takes away a lot of mystery. It doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to solve because there are huge issues still to overcome, but it is still much better and much further along and saves years, possibly decades off of research. There is, however, one fairly big problem with it at the moment, and it might not jump out to you right away, but the nature of the license as it is now is that essentially you cannot use AlphaFold 3 for commercial reasons. The problem is that if a, researcher at a university is trying to use it now to figure out something, and then 5-10 years down the track, they want to try and work with a large pharmaceutical company, for example, to commercialize it, there's going to be a lot of red tape and a lot of issues. In other issues, we have research that says a laser can block light and cast a shadow, which doesn't make a lot of sense at first. Essentially, a laser is just light, so light hitting light shouldn't do anything. However, a shadow is where there is a reduction in light. The way this works involves a lot of fine-tuning and stuffing around, but in simple terms, a laser at just the right wavelength and just the right setting, hitting another laser at just the right setting and just the right wavelength, can create a shadow in the substance it's passing through. The thing with this is that if you want to try and do it at home, it's probably going to be rather difficult and expensive, because you need a fairly large cube of ruby being a relatively precious gem. You'll also need a blue laser and a green laser, but that's a separate issue, as they're much easier to obtain. The research itself really does rely on the fact that the green light hitting the ruby's molecules creates a weird environment for the electrons, and because of this, the slightly shorter wavelength of blue light creates problems leading to the bizarre phenomena observed. That is, you see essentially a shadow. Of course, before rushing off to think, wow, let's try this ourselves, bear in mind it is preliminarily published research, that is, it is a pre-publication platform and has yet to be properly peer-reviewed. Although based on previous articles from this week's What Were They Thinking, there's a good chance you may find that up to 15 of the citations in this aren't even relevant. The final news item we have for you is a proof of Pythagoras' theorem published by a high school student. Although it's supposed to be impossible, clearly not, given that they've demonstrated this. And not just have they demonstrated it, but 10 different ways to demonstrate it. Pythagoras' theorem is essentially that if you take the long side of a right-angled triangle and square it, it should be equal to the two short sides of the triangle when they're added together, but before adding them together you need to square them. It's generally described as a squared plus b squared equals c squared. While we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty detail, understand that one of the challenges with this proof is that you needed to prove it without relying on the necessary trigonometry principles. So they didn't. They sidestepped the entire issue by taking a different approach and ending up with the same final result. That is, they could figure out the end meaning of what they needed without having to use trigonometry by itself. That therefore proves that trigonometry works. It's similar in a way to trying to define a word, but the only way people have been able to define it before now is to use the very word in itself. Similar to, say, how natural is used. If you ask someone to define natural, they'll say of nature or similar, but that's essentially saying that natural is of natural. You don't really have any understanding of what it really means. And that was their problem, and they have solved it by essentially saying, well, if we want to define natural, let's not actually touch on nature or natural and say what it's not, in a manner of speaking. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do provide any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.